Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another of the regular monthly meetings of Libertarian Herts. This month, David McDonagh is to speak on Mao Zedong, and China.
Thank you very much indeed, Bob. I suppose really the reason why I wanted to give this talk is because I happened to get this book a few years ago, which is Young Chang's and John Holliday's Mao, the Unknown Story. I had some old volumes of Mao's work, so I thought I'd go over it. And of course it's a way of dealing with the Bolsheviks and the new fashion of socialism and so on. I say the new fashion of socialism, I mean from it became fashionable around about 1870, beg your pardon. That's when liberalism went out of fashion and socialism more or less replaced it. And it's a funny thing talking about India and China, if you talk about those two countries. They both looked to the West about the same time. China, I suppose, more consciously. And they looked to the intellectuals there in Europe. And they made a big mistake. They thought, well, Europe is doing quite well. So perhaps we could follow the European intellectuals and ape them and do well as they do. But of course, in 1870, as I should have said earlier on, the fashion changed from liberalism, which more or less aided and abetted somewhat anyway, the development of a prosperous Europe, and changed to socialism, which really was a bit like we often hear of a self-made man makes his fortune and works hard and becomes wealthy, and then his son more or less wastes the whole fortune, and to that is the relationship, as far as I can see, between liberalism and socialism. Liberalism is the one that made the fortune, and socialism is hell bent to waste it. Now, of course, people do say that socialism is a bit idealistic, so people don't follow it as much as they might, and they can't completely follow the communism idea, because it's not really, it's anti-economics rather than economics, and it's not really practicable. But now, oddly enough, in this we have Mao and his father, because Mao's father, who Mao disliked intensely, was married. Pardon?
What was that?
Mao's father, who Mao disliked intensely, was born as an ordinary peasant and worked his way to become quite a successful farmer, quite a rich farmer. He married at the age of 15 to a lady who was 18, Mao's mother. Now Mao loved his mother because his mother was indulgent towards him, and his father wanted him to work hard. And Mao didn't particularly want to work hard and tried to dodge it. And so really they fitted this thing, the father made the money, and Mao, if he had a chance, might fritter it away. But of course his father only gave him a certain allowance. And so we've got this situation where one generation makes the wealth, and the other generation squanders it. And Mao decided to go for study and so on, and really to dodge work if possible. His father eventually cut his allowance, so he went to train as a teacher, which more or less was self-financing. And he did quite well in his studies. He came third in his whole group in the final college. He graduated third in the college. But then he continued his studies by going to a library. I've always said that if you go to a library, any library can beat any college anyway, if someone is only intent on study. The virtues of a college, I think, or of a university, is the network that you get, the network of friends. They do say it isn't what you know, it's who you know. And with that at age, the college is a perfect place, because then you get to know people. Even if you don't get to know knowledge, you get to know people. So that fits the college system ideally. But if you go to a library and you're serious about going to a library and studying, you can really outpace, I think, what the colleges have got to offer, if that's what you want to do. But you won't get the same social life, and you won't get the same network, and you won't get to know so many people. So, but he did both. He continued in the student role after he left college. He read a lot of, to set the Chinese stage for a bit. The real thing that happened in 1911 is that you had the collapse of the Ming dynasty, the last emperor, as it were, and this really was a sort of disillusionment among many people in China. They'd been treated very badly by the foreign devils, as they often called them, and Britain took Hong Kong off them in the Opium Wars and all that sort of thing seemed to have a humiliating effect upon many Chinese people, and they blamed Confucianism and the old ways and the classical language, and they turned to speaking the vernacular, and they turned towards the West and towards the outside world to try and catch up with the outside world, because they perceived that they'd fallen behind. Now, of course, they hadn't fallen behind. They hadn't been behind for a long time. And Miss Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, talks about China as a stagnant society. Well, I suppose it was stagnant in the way how Japan is stagnant, has been stagnant for the last couple of decades. Stagnant, but still quite rich, and round about 1850, Britain, I think, just about became the biggest economy or the richest economy, but it knocked China off the top spot. China was there, and as late as 1850. So was India, not too far behind, and of course all this follows from. If we read The Ultimate Resource by Julian Simon, all this follows from Simonian principles. A heavy population is almost bound to be rich. Of course, this is exactly why we look to India and China today to come up rather rapidly, because they've got all these people, and all these people do. I've got a chance of innovating and so on, and doing well and earning a lot of money. So really, it is really the. And of course, you only get a heavy population because you have been successful as well. So it was a fairly successful country until about 1850, but then it started to feel itself declining, and it had been stagnant for a long time anyway. And it started feeling humiliated vis-a-vis the rest of the world, especially the West. So it opened up a bit, but then. Strange thing happened. World War I broke out, of course, World War I in 1914, and there happened to be a custom whereby, of course, the French were called up to fight, and there happened to be a custom of Chinese men, and a lot of Chinese men went to France to replace the actual French chaps who were fighting at the front, replacing them in the French economy. And of course, they sent money back home to China, because France by that time was richer than China. They sent money home, and they also sent a lot of ideas home. And oddly enough, although it was really across the channel where this particular chap hung out for a long time, but anarchism became very popular in China. Now it was the post-1870 anarchism. In other words, anarchists who call themselves socialists, so which is not far off from saying, although socialists have various delusions, anarchists who call themselves statists. The socialists have delusions about the state. They, there's a strange sort of attitude they have to. On the one hand, they're against the state. On the other hand, they're a bit schizoid on it. On the other hand, they're all for the state, and you get these anarchists who, these these anarcho-communists, the followers of Kropotkin, who was in this country for a long time, a Russian prince, Prince Kropotkin, and he was in England for a long time, and very, in fact, he was, did a lot of his work in the English Royal Geographical Society. He was very keen on geography, and but anyway, from France, they got his ideas from France and they sent them back, and Kropotkin was very popular. And Mao read Kropotkin, he read a lot of it, read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, he read Montesquieu, Spirit of the Laws, we might deal with it at some time. I think he was dealing with Montesquieu at some time or other. And he read a lot of people who we have dealt with, like Rousseau, John Locke, and Tom Paine, and so on. He read all these people who we've actually dealt with here. All these ideas were going back, and these ideas were popular, but they're all basically socialist ideas, although many of them call themselves anarchist ideas. They're basically socialist ideas. And Mao was eclectic in all these ideas, but after 1917, he was impressed by that event, as indeed many people were, and he started taking Marx and Lenin far more seriously than he had done beforehand. He was rather sympathetic towards Bolshevism. A strange thing happened in World War One. China was not particularly enthusiastic as Japan. Maybe that's the reason. But anyway, Germany had got one or two only little colonies in China, but Japan won these colonies off Germany. And the Treaty of Versailles, although it held the rights of nations to self-determination, a very popular treaty, a very nationalist treaty, very popular. And by the way, before I go any further, I ought to say that Mao was always up front and in no undisguised manner a nationalist, first of all. He makes this quite clear. And one wonders just how much he certainly hasn't got the original Marxist claim, which basically says that nations are a sort of a sham. He hasn't got that at all. And of course, that's one of the things that Lenin maybe unwittingly jettisoned when he embraced in 1914 the theory of imperialism, which he basically replaced the class analysis with. And so being anti-imperialist was far more near to common sense than the pristine Marxist outlook, which was in favour of communism, which meant the abolition of money, the abolition of capitalism. So, I mean, what Lenin did really, I ought to perhaps deal with Lenin and get him out of the way. What Lenin did is, in 3 works, the first work was, many people miss it, but it's the most profound work really, What is to be Done. In this book, Lenin says, if we wait for the working class to understand communism, we'll be waiting forever. And what we need is an elite. Now, this unwittingly throws out the materialist interpretation of history, because the materialist interpretation of history held that there was no need for an elite, held that it became obvious when the capitalist mode of production was obsolete. It'd be obvious to the masses, we'd be able to see this, that it was obsolete. And we don't need an elite to point this out. Whereas in saying that we do need an elite to point it out, it's more or less jettisoning that. Now, of course, then he went on to 1914, which I've already mentioned, and replaced classes. The Marxist dogma was that the classes are real and nations are somewhat unreal. Now, what imperialism does, mainly following a book written by J.A. Hobson, Lenin more or less embraced this, and what this book more or less said is that nations are real and classes are not real at all, they don't really matter. And insofar, and there was 1 or 2 Leninists who were very bright and saw that really those who we call the working classes are actually exploiting the peasants in the backward country according to his theory. Well, that's true, that is according to Hobson's theory and according to Lenin's theory. Of course, it's utterly couldn't be. It's a million miles from Marxist theory, which is that you're exploited by going to work. And indeed, you do tend to be paid more the more you're exploited, which is another thing which is contrary to common sense. But at the same time, Marx has got a theory that wages are going to be driven down anyway, so they're down to subsistence. And there are some, Marx isn't totally coherent, but anyway, but he does have the idea that the more you are exploited, the more you'll be paid, which is contrary to common sense. I mean, quite a few of things in Marxism are very alien to common sense, whereas imperialism, which talks about England exploiting India or Africa or other countries, that makes far more, it might be false, but it makes far more sense to the man in the street. And then finally we get the 1917 thesis, where Lenin says there's a massive difference between socialism and communism, and this basically kicks communism into the long grass. It doesn't get rid of it completely, but it kicks it into the long grass and say the immediate aim is for socialism, which is redefined as state capitalism and or nationalisation, which of course wouldn't be very idealistic for the Marxists, and not really idealistic at all, but nevertheless far more realistic and something you can point to, and far nearer to common sense. So now this is the sort of thing that Mao, as I said just a few moments ago, always nationalistic, embraced, and this fitted nations quite well. And Mao did do the work of tailoring this to fit the peasants. So instead of having long words like proletariat and bourgeoisie, he had paper tigers and so on and so forth, which more or less fit, was understandable to the peasants. Now I remember what Mao did really to that is he fitted the theory for the mass urban society to one which was basically for a peasant society, which of course Russia was also largely a peasant society, and Lenin had done something like that himself, so Marxist-Leninism was far nearer to that. But in Birmingham, there was an organisation which was Maoist called the Communist Party of England, and they, instead of doing the general thing of fitting the theory to the people who were the audience, which is Mao's basic general idea, they just ate Mao and fitted the theories to people of Birmingham as though they were peasants, and talked about the running tigers and so on. And of course, people just laughed. What do you mean running tigers, paper tigers and so on? It was just nonsense. But of course, there were smarter Maoists than that. One of the smartest groups we ever came across was, of course, the British and Irish Communist Organisation, and a lot of them were Maoists. So the Maoists were a spectrum. There's the smart ones, being ICO, and there's the silly ones, which are the Communist Party of Great Britain. Not of Great Britain, but the Communist Party of England, beg your pardon. Communist Party of Great Britain was the ordinary Communist Party of Britain. And they were Stalinists, of course, but not particularly Maoist. Mao eventually, as I say, converted to this and fitted it to the peasants. That was his major work, so it was Marxist-Leninism and Maoism. But there's also other things that Mao had to offer in terms of quite wise in a sense. In this sense, I think he probably earned his place at the top because there was a number. I mean, Mao wasn't the leader. The official story is that he's one of the founding members of the Communist Party, but these people think that that's false. They deny and they think he wasn't there at the initial meeting, which is in 1919. He joined later, and he didn't even attend still later conferences, and he was a bit out on a limb for a long time. And Zhou Enlai, who later became very, very faithful to Mao, was more or less the leader. He was Moscow trained, far better Moscow trained than Mao, and he was more or less the leader. And there was Mao's teacher, who was certainly the professor, who later on, actually Mao probably followed this chap quite a lot, because this chap was later on accused of being a Trotskyite, Now, if anything, Mao was influenced by this idea of the permanent revolution. But I think what Trotsky meant by revolution is nearer to pristine Marxism than Trotsky was funny. Trotsky had again was in two minds. There's the practical. It was a bit like Tony Benn in Britain. There's the theoretical Trotsky. He was good. That was where his main heart was, I suppose. And then there was the practical Trotsky, who basically ignored all his theory and just carried on like a normal politician. When he had a chance in Lenin's government, he started advocating quite middle of the road things, which is exactly what Ben did in the Labour Party. As a technology minister, he was an ordinary sort of politician, but on the other hand, he was a theoretical politician as well. And it's kind of like two careers. Trotsky was the same. But Trotsky did, in his theoretical part, have this permanent revolution, which influenced Mao's teacher, and probably via Mao's teacher influenced Mao. But anyway, later on, when because Stalin, of course, got the job and Trotsky didn't, and Stalin became the number one communist theoretician. Some of his essays aren't all that bad. I've read a few of them. Really influenced by the BNICO. I've read quite a few of them. They're not too bad. They're not so bad. I mean, it could be worse. Stalin could be worse. And of course, Mao with the little red book, which I've mislaid actually, is not so bad. It reads a bit like Popper actually. Plenty of criticism, of course. But Mao was well, actually, there is a story about Popper that he didn't like criticism, despite the fact of eulogising it. And they did say about Popper that it was that he should have called his book "The Open Society and Its Enemies," the Open Society by one of its enemies. Well, that might be unfair to Popper. I've often thought it was, but it's quite fair to Mao, because the way how Mao used the criticism in the Little Red Book, which is worth reading through actually. It's not bad, Little Red Book. I read it through recently, the last few years when I was doing the 10 worst books. For the site, and it was quite good. I thought, well, this is not such a bad little book, but the man himself is a wicked chap, which I'll cover just in a little while. And certainly that would fit the joke on Popper of saying, because Mao did like to criticise others, but he didn't like to be criticised himself. And this happened time and time again, where he more or less had the idea that if he opened on criticism, Mao had the idea that if he opened things to criticism, then people would eulogise him instead of criticising him. And they never did, and when they didn't, he didn't like it. And another good idea he had, which major idea, is that he did think that there was plenty of people in China, and these plenty of people could do anything. He more or less took that many hands make life light work to his heart. He took that absolute to heart. He thought that the masses who put their mind to something could do almost anything, and he liked the idea that sometimes they can do so at the cost of their lives. But with China, we've got so many people that we can afford to lose these people, and they'll soon replenish. And he even said on one occasion that if we had a nuclear war would kill off a hell of a lot of people. But we've got so many people in China, the rest would soon breed so heavily that you'd soon get your numbers back up again. So he's obsessed with this all along, and it's at the root of many of his of much of his folly. But anyway, what really prepared for Mao was this collapse of the old regime, as it were, the Qing dynasty in 1911. But then you had this strange thing in the wake of World War I, the Versailles Treaty, which actually allowed the Japanese to keep the land that they'd taken off the Germans, which the Germans, not much land, which the Germans had taken off China, and his land in China, instead of handing it back. They allowed. Now this brought forward tremendous demonstrations, first of all in Peking, and then throughout China. It was mainly demonstrations were against Japan, boycotting Japanese goods and burning Japanese books and so on. And because the Allies had been indifferent to this, to the Japs hanging on to the land they'd won off the Germans in the war, they were also mistrustful, the whole of China was mistrustful of all the countries that took part of Versailles. They thought that they were for dividing up China and not allowing China to become unified. They called them foreign devils, which I think was far more accurate than what they called them later on, which was imperialists, because these people weren't particularly imperialists. The only country that was imperialist in regard to China was, in fact, Japan, because imperialism means build up an empire. Now, I mentioned the Communist Party of England. Their chief propagandist, once I had a conversation with him and he asked me a few questions. I'll give him a spiel of Marxism. This is back in 1968. And he says, I've listened to you. He says, for about 15 minutes now, he says, you haven't mentioned the word imperialism once. And then he stormed off. So this was tremendous. Now, of course, even Galbraith knew that Marx considered imperialism to be pretty much a good thing, that it paved the way for communism, you see. Whereas Mao thought it was a very, very worst thing possible because he's basically a nationalist, you see. And so, and of course, this chap in Birmingham didn't have I'm afraid, although he talked a lot, who knows what he was talking about, but he didn't really have much idea of what imperialism really referred to. He did use it as sort of constituted blank imperialism. It was an important word, he knew not what, you know. But anyway, he knew that I didn't have it in my vocabulary, and of course I didn't, because it wasn't part of original Marxism. But anyway, Mao rather, did a bit about Chiang Kai-shek and Sun
Yat-sen.
Sun Yat-sen, yep. Sun Yat-sen, of course, was a Christian, and he married a Methodist lady who, now Sun and the Methodist lady had been trained in the United States of America, and so had her sister, the two sisters, and her younger sister. And they were trained, the two girls were quite pretty and very articulate. And he married this girl, Sun, and but sadly he died in 1925 of cancer. And there was his favourite person was Chiang Kai-shek, his second in command. And Chiang Kai-shek had been trained in Japan, in imperialist, military expertise. And he was fairly well trained in Japan, but he had a tremendous respect for the Japanese military. And now, he was second in command and his heir apparent. However, when Sun died, there was a long, drawn-out process to find a replacement for him, and it wasn't obvious that Chiang would emerge as the new leader. But he did eventually emerge as the new leader. And shortly afterwards, he married the younger sister, who was very articulate, and actually he was probably landing on his feet, because this lady, I think, played a wonderful part in Chinese history, because especially vis-a-vis the Americans. Because what happened is that when the Japanese decided to push forward to get, they must have thought, well, after the Treaty of Versailles, although it had this dogma of the right of nations to self-determination, the Japs must have thought, well, really speaking, this is a bit of cant, and really speaking, they're allowing the British Empire to go on, and the empire, days of empire isn't at an end. It's about time we had a nice little Japanese empire, and we can extend our lands in China, and perhaps we can perhaps we can rule the whole of China. Japan, of course, had been for many centuries influenced by Chinese culture, and they used to have a maxim: Chinese know-how, Japanese spirit. And when they had one of the Chinese religions which I think it was a version of. I think it was a version of Buddhism. But anyhow, the factor in it was Jen, which was love. The Japanese threw that bit out and had all the rest of it, a bit like we do in the West with Buddhism, where we just do our Buddhist exercises and ignore the theory.